Hello, everybody. This is topic 6 in marine and aquatic ecology, and we are moving into the population unit of this course. So this unit explores how population density of species changes in space and time, and the subject involves understanding and working with equations for population growth. And we will do this using a variety of numerical and visual approaches. Understanding population dynamics is crucial to understanding how species interact with their environment in the present and also over evolutionary time. So population dynamics has many applied uses in conservation, environmental protection, and economics. At the population level of organization, which we're now at in this unit 2 of the course, the subfield of ecology is just called population ecology or demography. And it's often coupled with genetics, in which case it is called ecological genetics or population genetics. Remember, ecology is multi and interdisciplinary field of study. So here's our schematic diagram again of the struggle for existence, which basically depicts the relationship between organismal ecology and population ecology. So the central metaphor in ecology is Darwin's struggle for existence, and that struggle occurs because resources are finite, and they become depleted as population density grows ever larger. And that's the density both of your own species and of other species with which you interact and compete. And the outcome of the struggle for existence is adaptation. Adaptation is just the match between species and their environment. A higher fitness in the environment you're adapted to than other environments. So because of trade-offs, there's a restricted distribution for all species. And in Unit 1 of this course, we discussed these outcomes, and understanding how organisms are adapted to their environment is organismal ecology, which has two fundamental approaches, and these are behavioral and physiological. So population ecology, in part, is the study of the mechanisms that produce the outcome of adaptation. And the goal of population ecology is a rigorous and mathematical and predictive theory of the mechanisms that are responsible for the struggle for existence. So a major goal of population ecology is to find the connections, relationships, interactions between fitness which is an emergent property of organisms. I mean, organisms have fitness, but not the cells and organs within the organism. Once you have the organism level of organization, then suddenly you have a property, an emergent property called fitness. And population ecology looks for relationships or connections, interactions between fitness, an emergent property of organisms, and emergent properties of populations, such as density, dispersion, and growth rate. So these properties of populations, density, dispersion, and growth rate, can profoundly affect organism fitness, and vice versa. Fitness of organisms is responsible for population density, population dispersion, population growth rate. So there's this endless cycle going on between these two levels of organization. And you can't understand what's going on at one level without also understanding what's going on on the second level as well. Okay, so we want to understand the population level in this unit of the course. So what is a population? It's a collection of many organisms, all belonging to the same species, and showing spatial and temporal continuity. So a population has spatial continuity. Individuals are related to each other, and the closer in space, usually the more closely related individuals are. They're all the same species, so their individuals are capable of interbreeding with each other using whatever mating system and sexual system they have. And a population has temporal continuity. Next generation's individuals are the offspring of this generation's individuals. And this generation is the offspring of the last generation. So there's temporal continuity. So you can visualize a population as a collection of individuals here and now in the present. And an evolutionary lineage, or just lineage for short, is simply a population plus all populations descended from it and ancestral to it by implication. So this is an evolutionary lineage. So you can look at this lineage at any point in time and see that there is a population there. But if, as you go back in time, the individuals in that population become more and more different from the present. And as you go forward, the same thing happens. But at each point, you have a population. And if you take all those populations together, that's what we call an evolutionary lineage. Now, the lineage can branch, and lineage branches if two populations share the same ancestors but do not share descendants. So, in other words, the descendants of one population are not the descendants of the other population. There's two separate branches. So, this is the break in the temporal continuity of the lineage, so that now either branch can be considered a separate lineage. Both branches, however, are still part of the original lineage because they are both descended from this original lineage. And eventually, you will have an evolutionary tree of lineages connected in this way. And we saw evolutionary trees of marine mammals such as the cetaceans, the whales, dolphins, and porpoises. We saw this already in the first unit of this class. And in reality, what we were talking about were populations and evolutionary lineages here. And really, what Darwin showed us and proposed in his book was that all life on Earth could be considered a single lineage. All life on Earth is a single lineage if we assume that all life on Earth evolved from a single ancestral population. So, similarly, if any taxonomic group could be a single lineage if all the members of that group evolved from the same ancestor, and if that ancestor is included in the group, and if all descendants of that ancestor are included in the group too. So the group is monophyletic. So you just have one branch off the tree in that case. And if the common ancestor is not included in the group, then the group must contain more than one lineage. So the branches of its evolutionary tree don't all meet at the bottom. Or if only some of the descendants of the common ancestor are included in the group, then the group doesn't encompass the entire lineage. So as soon as you have an evolutionary tree like this, all of a sudden it becomes complicated how you're going to call the names that you're going to call different branches and different parts of different branches, since everything is changing as you go along the lineage. Okay, so if you have a branch like you see here, because the two branches no longer share descendants, that means they're reproductively isolated from each other. If they undergo evolutionary change independently of each other, then speciation may occur, assuming neither branch goes extinct. So if the change becomes enough, so it's no longer possible for this population to interbreed with this population up here, then we say that speciation has occurred. A new species has evolved. So we got two species now rather than just one species. So speciation is the production of a new species, and how much a branch of a lineage has to diverge before it's called a new species is a matter of disagreement. In principle, the adaptive process that produces a new species, if it continues, eventually will produce a new genus also, and then a new family, then a new order, maybe a new phylum, if this process continues to go on for long enough. And we saw this in the cetacean example in evolutionary tree, where we saw multiple speciation, multiple branching, and changing along those branches to the point where a new order of aquatic uh, animals was produced, the cetaceans, different from the order that it arose from on land some 70 million years ago. And within the cetaceans are large numbers of lineages as well, and many less extreme branchings, including those producing two novel suborders, the toothed and baleen whales. So the evolutionary tree can be reconstructed by a combination of different kinds of evidence. There's fossil evidence and there's genetic or DNA evidence. So these trees are not easy to reconstruct, though, if there are gaps in the evidence or if different lines of evidence seem to conflict with each other. Okay, so now let's just consider, in case you are skeptical, why should we make this jump from organism to population? What's so important about populations in the study of ecology? Why don't we just keep studying organisms and how they're matched to the environment? Ecology is, after all, the interface of organisms and their environment. So, what do populations have to do with that interface? How do they help us understand that interface? Well, consider the concept of fitness that I just laid out. The ability to survive and reproduce. What are the implications of that ability? Okay, well, it's basically your lifetime reproductive success. What are the implications of reproducing? Well, you either reproduce now or survive to reproduce later. And if you survive to reproduce, what happens? Well, you multiply. So, what happens if you start with two organisms, say a male and a female, who have that ability to survive and reproduce? Well, expression of that fitness is the same thing as bringing a population into existence. Expression of fitness, namely surviving and reproducing, is the same thing as converting two individuals to many individuals. Potentially many individuals, potentially even billions of individuals. Well, 7.7 billion in 2019, and now we're up to what? Well, now it's up to 7.8 billion in 2021, April 4, for the human population, total worldwide to be exact. So, human beings have a phenomenal ability to survive and reproduce. They've translated their fitness into a population of 7.8 billion and counting. So, in fact, they're so fit that they may even qualify as an exception to our rule that every species is absent from nearly everywhere. Human beings seem to be just about everywhere. Well, so what? What if the population of human beings has essentially taken over the planet? So what if organisms don't occur as solitary individuals, but rather they occur in populations, often very big populations? Organisms have to deal with the flux of matter and energy across their body surface and find a way of dealing with their environment, whether or not they're just solitary individuals or whether they exist in a big population. Why are populations important in ecology? Well, number one, there are more things to become adapted to than the things we've been talking about so far. What are these other things? Well, the number or density of individuals, the population size around you, including individuals of your own species and individuals of other species. Population density can be an extremely powerful selective force. Every species interacts with its mate, its family, its relatives, non relatives within the population, and also other species, and also the abiotic environment. And the number of these interactions and their effect on fitness will depend strongly on the total number of individuals in the population per unit area or its density. So, for example, increased population density might lead to a food scarcity that increases the death rate within a population. So, density influences fitness. In fact, this is a central part of Darwin's concept of the struggle for existence. Increase in population size or density results in a reduction in the amount of resource per individual. This leads to the struggle for existence, which favors individuals that are better adapted. If resources never became scarce, there would be little selection, according to Darwin's chapter 3, and perhaps little adaptive evolution. And resources become scarce partly because population size, numbers, can rapidly become very large. And individuals of every species also interact with other species. Other species are an intrinsic part of the environment of every organism. And we haven't yet looked at how organisms become adapted to the activities of other species. Take, for example, the human population again. Why does our understanding of adaptation and therefore ecology have to take into account the size of the population? Well, by virtue of their population, their numbers, the density of human beings on the planet, we have changed the conditions of existence for ourselves and for an enormous number of other species in an uncountable number of ways. The human population is probably one of the most important selective forces now in existence for many species. And the crucial point here is that it's not any individual human being that has this impact. It's the sum total effect of a large number of people that adds up to an enormous selective effect on other species. So, as emergent properties of the population, basically the density that is having this effect, not any individual. Although the effect of the population certainly is determined by the individuals that compose it, the large selective effect, the size of the effect, is due to the combined effects of a very large number of individuals. And certainly the human population has a negative effect on species that use the same resources as humans, and many of these have gone extinct as a result, and those that haven't will have to find a way to become adapted or face the same fate themselves. On the other hand, the population may be considered a potentially very rich resource for some parasitic disease species um, who now have this huge population of warm, healthy, nutritious flesh and blood ready for exploitation. In this case, becoming adapted for the other species, for the parasite, means finding a strategy of exploitation, which means overcoming resistance from the immune system rather than, say, competition. And there are new deadly diseases evolving this way every human generation. And the greater the human population density is, the easier it will be for new species to spread, as we all know intimately now with our experience with the coronavirus. So, in this case, the large human population is having a positive effect. It's having a positive effect on those species that parasitize us, take advantage of our high density and social activities to spread, makes it easier to be parasitized. So the coronavirus experience illustrates the population principle nicely. If we live as solitary individuals, then we have little or no effect on the fitness of the virus. But if we exist as a population of interacting individuals, then suddenly the fitness of the virus increases. It can survive and reproduce. Without a population of hosts, the virus is completely powerless. In other words, without fitness. And conversely, for the human population, a single disease organism doesn't mean a thing. One single smallpox cell or one single virus particle in your body will have no noticeable effect whatsoever. But those cells or particles can survive and reproduce. They have a fitness, and it's the population of disease cells or virus particles that reproduce to large numbers and proliferate throughout your body tissues that has the negative effect, not any single cell or particle. And of course, diseases are treated by preventing the disease population from increasing in your body and causing it to decrease to levels at which your own immune system can eliminate it. So, populations of other species can be considered a regular, predictable component of any organism's environment. They can be a positive component, for example, a food resource. They can also be a negative component. They can be a competitor, predator, prey, or disease pathogen. Either way, a component that the organism can become adapted to. So, these are the main reasons why we need to look at populations to see how fast they can grow, how big or dense they can become as a result of interactions among individuals within the population that influence fitness, how the population is distributed in space, and ultimately how important a population can then be to the other species with which it interacts, including humans who might depend on the population and its reproductive rate for subsistence. And of course, the population can interact with itself also. So, this next section of the course then is a look at adaptation in interacting populations, and we understand those adaptations in terms of how they enable your population to grow and persist in the presence of those other populations. And there are, of course, other reasons for wanting to understand populations. These are technical and they are very practical. And the number two reason why we need to look at populations to understand the interface between organism and environment, the way organisms become adapted to their environment, it's not actually true that organisms become adapted to their environment. Well, you might ask, why have we been talking about adaptations of organisms then for the last month? Well, organisms don't undergo evolutionary change by definition. Evolution is changed in the genetic makeup from one generation to the next, on down the lineage. An organism doesn't evolve adaptations, obviously. Organisms differ in their ability to leave descendants, though, so the population changes in its genetic makeup as it becomes dominated by descendants of the most fit organisms of past generations. So, evolution is something that happens to populations over time or lineages, not organisms by definition. but it results in a match between organisms and their environment. And that match tells us what kinds of organisms in the past were most successful at leaving offspring. So, number two, the population is the evolutionary unit. And the number three reason, closely related to number two, as we saw above, the ability of a population to increase in size is a reflection of the fitness of the organisms in the population. It increases only because those organisms survive and reproduce. So we can quantify our concept of fitness very easily and make it mathematically exact and rigorous. For example, we can define fitness of a type of organism as the rate of increase of a population composed of those individuals. So we have a measure then of the fitness of organisms. And we can make rigorous comparisons of fitnesses of two different types of organisms. We can ask then, how able is an organism of type A able to replace the population with copies of itself? So now we approach the idea of fitness more quantitatively within the context of a population. We've already done this to a certain extent. Remember our example of the cost of meiosis and sexually reproducing females? It may not have been obvious right away, but the whole argument was framed in terms of the ability of asexual females to increase in numbers relative to sexual females. It's almost as if we had two conceptually different populations and compared their rates of increase. In reality, though, what we have in mind is two types of individuals in the same population. And what we're thinking about is the ability of one type to replace that population with its own descendants. So, in other words, how fast they're able to replace themselves in the population. As they die, how many offspring do they leave to carry on to maintain the population? We saw that asexuals reproduce more rapidly since they don't have to produce males. So we expect their numbers to increase in frequency in the population at the expense of sexual females who lose out because the males they produce don't contribute to leaving offspring. Also, we talked about evolution of altruism through kin selection, which is another example of the increase in numbers of a kind of individual within a population. The ability of altruists to create a population composed of altruists, as long as the altruism doesn't have too big of a cost and is directed towards relatives that are closely enough related. And this will cause an increase in numbers of individuals carrying the altruism allele at the genetic locus within the population. So again, the context of this argument was a population and the ability of a certain type of individual, namely individuals carrying the altruism allele, to replace the empty slots in the population with their own descendants. So we have individuals in generation one and one type of individual being able to fill the slots of the next generation more effectively than the other type. And this continues over time until that type of individual with a higher fitness eventually occupies the entire population. Also, we talked about evolution of cooperation as a tit-for-tat strategy of paying back in kind. The tit-for-tat strategy can increase in frequency in a population, and again, exactly according to this diagram, against many other strategies of social interaction. So individuals who pay back in kind to those they interacted with in the past are better able to replace their population with descendants of themselves. So all of these examples were implicitly about not just organisms, but populations and the ability of different kinds of organisms to survive and reproduce so well that they can create a population of their descendants. And calculating this ability of a population to increase relative to another population, we have calculated fitness, okay? The ability of a population to increase in size relative to another population. So now we will continue along these lines, but we'll get a bit more complicated. We'll continue this exercise not only for a single population, but for two populations interacting with each other. And we'll look at how fast each population can increase in the presence of the other population. And populations and how they behave are interesting in and of themselves to population ecologists. The internal dynamics of populations can be very complicated, but predictable, and has extremely important practical implications for sustainable harvest, for example. And a large science called demography has grown to study and understand those internal dynamics, especially in human populations. And so to predict population growth and decline and patterns of population growth and decline. All right, so practical reasons are of interest to ecologists and to many other human disciplines. How populations of agricultural and aquacultural species grow and maintain themselves under a variety of conditions, especially in response to populations of disease organisms. That's obviously major economic interests. And of course, populations of farm animals and plants and populations of fish and game are economically of interest. How big the tuna population is translates immediately into how many dollars earned or food obtained for commercial or artisanal subsistence fishermen. Population ecologists are employed by the government to manage these populations of fish and game to levels where they will continue to support the local economy. And these people are called wildlife biologists or fisheries biologists, and they work generally for government agencies at the county or state, federal level, or they form NGOs where they offer their services as population ecologists to governmental agencies for planning, for conservation, for sustainable harvest. And all of these fish and wildlife people are studying mathematical models of population increase and decrease in order to keep the population size at a level that will sustain the economy of those who make a living on these species, or at a level where rare species are not in danger of extinction. Because, of course, populations of rare species are of tremendous interest to conservation ecologists. Why are populations of these rare species unable to increase in size? What can we do to help them to increase to healthy levels? The Mediterranean monk seal, for example, is barely able to survive and reproduce enough to replace itself in the Mediterranean, and there are many ecologists who are looking at ways to increase the population size. Fisheries biologists have now become conservation biologists since many commercial fish species are on the verge of extinction due to overfishing. Pacific coast salmon runs, for instance. So all the major stocks of fish in all the world's oceans have decreased down to probably 10 to 15% of what they originally were. Commercial and recreational fishing, artisanal fishing. If you ask Croatians how many groupers did they catch on a single day, what was their best catch? If you ask people who were old enough to be doing this in 1940, they will say their best catch is 25. Ask this question to people who are just started fishing now, they'll say their best catch is around 5 or so individuals per day. So we can see that the population has decreased just by anecdotal accounts of the people doing the fishing. And there are many papers published showing how perceptions of people fishing for a living have changed over time and how people's perception of the environment is getting worse and worse over time. In terms of conservation locally here's a summary graph showing the number of species in the Adriatic, the North Adriatic Sea, that have become depleted over time has become pretty much all the species, alien species increasing, and rare species increasing, and number of extirpations also going up. The Steller sea cow is a kind of manatee, is a classic example of the vulnerability of even enormous populations to extinction. There were millions of individuals in the Pacific Ocean originally, and relentless hunting of this slow moving and docile species by Europeans brought the population down to a few dozen by the mid 1700s. And by 1768, the last Steller sea cow was shot and the species went extinct. Also of conservation interest, the population dynamics of invasive species. Most introductions of foreign species are not successful because presumably the introduced species is not as highly adapted as the native species and is outcompeted. Occasionally, however, introduced species ironically do far better than the native species. This can create problems. Many invasive species eliminate native plants and animals essentially by outcompeting them or changing abiotic conditions so severely that the native species can no longer survive. Wildlife and conservation ecologists study the population dynamics of these species to find ways to control their spread. And probably the most well-known marine invasive species in the Mediterranean are the invasive algae Caulerpa taxifolia and Caulerpa racemosa. Overall, there are now nearly 400 invasive species in the Mediterranean, including over 100 in the Adriatic, from several taxonomic groups: protozoans, crustaceans, fish, macrophytes, large algae, mollusks, polychaetes, and other invertebrates. And these have caused many changes in the marine environment that marine populations ecologists have studied. And to understand why and how these fast species spread, it's necessary to understand the mathematics of population increase, which is a subset of population ecology. Also, the field of epidemiology, or the incidence and distribution and control of disease in a population, is essentially the population ecology of diseases and their hosts. Understanding which components of the human population, for example, are vulnerable to coronavirus infection is a matter of understanding the mathematics describing the increase in size of the COVID 19 population. These mathematical equations, as we will see, as we'll be studying them, are differential equations of calculus that relate population density of both species to fitness of both species. We won't be doing any calculus, but we'll just be looking at it visually and intuitively. There are many marine diseases that have interesting consequences and economically important ones, such as the sea star wasting disease in the Pacific that's going on right now, epidemic right now. And in the past, we've had the eelgrass wasting disease all through the Atlantic coast of North America. Red tides or harmful algal blooms are essentially a population phenomenon. Jellyfish outbreaks all over the world are a population phenomenon. And of course, last but not least, what do we do about the ever increasing human population? It can't keep increasing forever, it has to stop eventually. And that means one of two things: the birth rate needs to go down and will go down, or the death rate has to go up, or both. And this mathematical uncertainty is something that is likely to affect all of us sooner or later, or at least our immediate descendants. The human population's rate of growth, then, is a prime subject of human ecology. Demographers are predicting the rate of increase of the human population in all countries, and the results will have economic and definitely political implications. All of these phenomena here are a direct result of the large human population. Atmospheric change, just widespread collapse of the world's fisheries, loss of soil, farmland, depletion of groundwater, deforestation, and also extinction rates are going up as a result of the increase in the human population size. So, do you think it's important and useful to study population growth? All right, so let's talk about population structure, our first topic in the population unit of this class. What is population structure? Well, it's all of those properties of populations that are not properties of single organisms. So as we move up the biological ladder from organism to population, we see new properties such as density, dispersion, and growth rate. These properties are fundamental components of the environment of every organism and are not only important determinants of every organism's fitness, but also the manifestations of the fitness of organisms in the population. Population density determines the influence that a population can have on other populations and also influences the fitness of individuals in the population. The fitness of individuals also influence density. For example, if individuals increase their fitness by migrating. Dispersion, or the pattern of arrangement of individuals in space, is certainly an outcome of individual fitness. Individuals arrange themselves where resources are abundant and accessible. Dispersion can also influence the fitness of other interacting species, for example, predators, prey, and competitors. The rate of growth is a combined effect of the fitness of all organisms in the population. So, growth rate, basically, you can define it as the mean fitness of an organism in the population. So, let's start with population dispersion. Dispersion is simply the arrangement of individuals in space within a population, and there are three possible kinds of population dispersion. We've got clumped, which is also called aggregated or patchy in English. We've got uniform, which is also called spaced. And then we have random dispersion. Which pattern a particular species or population conforms to can potentially tell you quite a bit about the environmental factors that are important in the life of those individuals and controlling their ability to survive and reproduce. So, first question, on the global scale, how are species usually dispersed? Answer, usually patchy. This is simply another way of saying that most species are absent from almost everywhere. They occur in patches of suitable habitat, suitable niche, which are fairly rare and are absent from everywhere else. This seems to be a question about adaptations and trade-offs, but it's also a question about populations. To say that a species is absent from somewhere is the same as saying its population growth rate there is always negative. To say it's present there is to say its population growth rate is potentially positive. Strictly speaking, this is not always true. A species can be present somewhere even though its population growth rate there is negative. There may have been recent immigration, for example. Conversely, a species may be absent from a location even if their population growth rate there could be positive. There's a barrier to migration. So why is population growth positive in some species but negative in others? Well, obviously because adaptation and fitness vary. They vary in part due to variation in the abiotic conditions in the environment. This fact brings us straight to the concept of the niche again. The niche is an abstract volume within which a species is capable of maintaining its population. So, for example, think of a marine shrimp again. It needs a particular temperature and salinity in order to survive and reproduce. If its fitness is sufficiently high, it can maintain a population. The range of salinities and temperatures within which it can maintain a population constitutes a space with a definable boundary. Of course, temperature and salinity are not the only factors that determine fitness. If you add pH, oxygen content of the water, current strength, and sediment size, sediment composition, and so on, you'll result in not a two-dimensional area, but a hypervolume in many dimensions. This n-dimensional hypervolume of abiotic conditions within which a species can maintain a population is the fundamental niche, as we've defined it. And this idea of equating the species niche with an n-dimensional hypervolume originated with G. Evelyn Hutchinson in 1957 in a paper entitled Concluding Remarks of a Symposium on Ecology. And I've drawn the niche as a rectangular volume, but in reality it can be any shape, and it's not likely to be rectangular. And remember, the presence of competitors and predators may restrict the niche of the species. Predators, for example, are extremely abundant here. Then they might eliminate our shrimp from this region of its fundamental niche. That boxes in the species even more. This new box that the species finds itself in is called the realized niche. Likewise, the shrimp might be a better competitor in its realized niche than some other shrimp and exclude the other species from that region of the niche space. So, fundamental niche is the niche it could occupy in the absence of enemies of other species. The realized niche is the niche it occupies in reality in the presence of various biotic enemies, predators, competitors, diseases, pathogens, and so on. Fundamental niche defines abiotic conditions, the realized niche, both abiotic and biotic conditions. So, this idea of the niche as an n-dimensional hypervolume is one of the most pervasive ideas in ecology. It encapsulates the idea of adaptation. It also encapsulates the idea that species are restricted in their distribution due to that adaptation. It also includes the idea of population increase. It is used to understand important interactions between species in competition and predation. And we'll see it's also used in the community unit of this course to understand patterns of species diversity and especially the role of competition in affecting the number of different species in a given area. Now, it's important to realize that niche does not refer to the position of a species in real space. This is not real space, obviously. That position in space is called its geographical distribution. We can also describe that geographical distribution in terms of the habitats it includes. But habitat is, again, not the same as the niche, but rather describes the kind of community the species occurs in, which may be correlated with a variety of abiotic conditions, most of which are outside the species' fundamental niche. In some cases, as when an important abiotic condition varies predictably in space, the spatial distribution is an accurate indicator of that abiotic condition. So, for example, the position along a seashore or intertidal elevation profile. The elevation is a very good indicator of the average amount of time that location is underwater or exposed to air during the year. So, this is a sandy beach in Oregon, a profile, a cross section through the beach. We see that these benthic species here occupy characteristic locations on the beach. These are the saturation zone here in sand that is always saturated with water, the resurgence zone in here, that's sand that is very wet but not quite saturated. The retention zone is damp sand, and the drying zone right up here, sand that is almost completely dry. Each species occupies a predictable niche on the beach related to the moisture regime at that niche, which is also a physical location on the beach. So populations of a species are not dispersed randomly across the environment, but within a particular abiotic niche that sometimes is spatially predictable, but often not. For example, the light wavelength niche in the euphotic zone of the ocean. Different phytoplankton species have different photosynthetic and accessory pigments in their cells, which enable them to use different wavelengths of light. These are different wavelengths for photosynthesis. Since green blue light penetrates the greatest depth into the ocean, species that can utilize light near the green wavelengths will have a higher photosynthetic rate. um, at depth than species that cannot use light near the green wavelength. Phytoplankton populations tend to be not randomly distributed at depths in the euphotic zone, but rather occur at depths where their pigment system is adapted to the remaining incident light. So red algal populations tend to occur lower on the rocky intertidal shore than green algal populations. So the red algae do not absorb strongly in the red region, otherwise they wouldn't be red. But instead, they absorb more strongly in the green region, take advantage of that light at greater depths. The green algae, however, do absorb strongly in the red region, which would be useless unless they were near the surface where they can actually access red light. As you would predict, there's some evidence of trade-offs in niche dimensions. So a species that can tolerate a wide range of one condition might not be able to tolerate a wide range of other conditions. For example, lugworms versus bloodworms. Bloodworms can tolerate a wide range of organic content in the sediment, but are restricted to a very narrow range of tidal elevation, right above about 2 meters elevation on a sandy beach. Lugworms, on the other hand, require a high organic content in the sediment, but can survive a wide range of tidal elevations. So as this appears that it might be costly, the ability to tolerate a wide range of some condition might be costly, make it more difficult to tolerate a wide range of other conditions in your niche. So several generalizations can be made regarding abiotic niches of plants and animals. So generally, if a species occupies a wide region of one niche dimension, it does so at the expense of some other niche dimension. So it does not tolerate a wide range along other dimensions. So this is explainable on the basis of physiological trade-offs. Becoming adapted to a wide range of values of some factor is likely to be costly. And so reduce your adaptedness to all but a few values of some other environmental factors or factor. Second, niches occupying the same spatial area, for example, a sandy beach or rocky intertidal habitat on some coastline, they're not distributed at random. They tend to overlap each other less than would be expected by chance. For example, clams in estuaries. So, for example, Washington clams and gaper clams occur along the same range of percent organic content sediments, but they occur at different tidal elevations. So, niches are not distributed at random. They tend to overlap each other less than would be expected by chance. So this is explainable on the basis of competition and predation. For example, a superior competitor might eliminate the inferior competitor over some region of the common fundamental niche. And this reduces the amount of niche overlap. And we'll talk about this more in the context of competition and competitive divergence. And third, closely related species living in the same community often have niches that are adjacent to each other but do not overlap. For example, check out this Eohaustorius crustacean here living in the saturation zone, the wet sand. Its relative up here, this Eohaustorius up here, is outside the wet sand. Mostly it's in the sort of transitional zone between the resurgence and the retention zone. Another example are fish of the Gobiidae family, the goby family in the Adriatic. So they live close together, but in a slightly different niche in the sand. So being related likely results in being similar in abiotic requirements, and therefore you have niches that are adjacent to each other, But again, each species may be the better competitor in a different region of the niche space and eliminate the other species from that region. So you have slightly different niches of closely related species. All right, so let's take a local example, the seagrass genus Posidonia. The species is absent from almost everywhere on the planet. If you were to just take a random point anywhere, it's almost certain that you wouldn't find any Posidonia there. Okay. So the basic question in population structure, population dispersion is why does a species occur where it does and not elsewhere? Well, Posidonia, this genus Posidonia, occurs in two locations on Earth, the Mediterranean and southern Australia. So in the Med, there's only one species, Posidonia oceanica, and in Australia, there are about 8 different species in the genus. In the genus, why this disjunct distribution? Why does the genus occur nowhere else on the planet in these two locations? Well, there's two possible answers to this question. Answer number one, the niche of the Posidonia genus occurs only in these locations and nowhere else in the world. That's a possibility. The populations are boxed into this geographical range because these are the only places where on the planet where Posidonia can exist within its niche, within its n-dimensional hypervolume, but we don't know what that is. So if that's true, then that's a very familiar answer, right? Because Posidonia has then become adapted to the conditions in these specific locations, and in return for that adaptedness has lost its adaptedness to every other piece of real estate on the planet. This explanation is very simplistic and probably obvious, but it's still very interesting because it implies that there is something very, very special about these specific areas. What could that possibly be? What is the Posidonia niche? Or at least that portion of the niche that is restricting it to the Med and Australia, nowhere else. Well, that's a question that we don't have any answer to yet. And explanation number two, maybe Posidonia's niche can be found in many other places in the world. So why then is the seagrass not found in any of these areas? Well, maybe simply because it has not migrated there at least yet. So dispersal or lack of it is another possible explanation. So there are two possible reasons why a particular species does not live at a particular place: restriction of dispersal and restriction of the niche. So now this lack of dispersal idea certainly could apply to areas far from the species range, since such travel would require transport over a long period of time. But it is possible through either seeds or fragments of the rhizome, seagrasses, all species are capable of vegetative asexual reproduction from the rhizomes. But this dispersal barrier explanation just doesn't cut it when we consider anywhere right along the border of the actual distribution. Anywhere along this border, um, but this dispersal barrier explanation just doesn't cut it when we consider anywhere right along the border of the actual distribution. Okay, so anywhere along this border, Posidonia certainly could migrate out into the Atlantic, into the Black Sea. Um, without any problem from within their distribution. So what's keeping them strictly within this area can't be lack of migration out. Here the explanation has to be something to do with the Posidonian niche. So what is Posidonia's niche, or at least that portion of the niche that ends right along the boundary? Obviously seagrasses need light, so they are restricted to the euphotic zone, and the upper euphotic zone is they need a minimum of about 10% of the incident light in order to have a positive net photosynthesis. And so this means the Posidonia genus can't maintain a population deeper than about 40 feet maximum. And that's in the Mediterranean where the water is very clear. Posidonia also needs to be in full seawater. It does not tolerate fresh water. It also requires a suitable substrate, sediment with particles the size of sand grains or larger, up to loose rock and boulders, with spaces between rocks where roots can penetrate. Also requires low energy. Posidonia beds can be eroded away in shallow water from storm waves, either a bura or a yugo. If we continue to list the range of conditions that the genus is capable of maintaining a population within, then we will most likely see its niche becoming smaller and patchier over the broad scale. So gentle slopes with sediment and clear water, less than 40 meters depth, warm conditions, no winter freezing, high salinity, slow currents, small waves. As we consider more and more requirements, it's possible that we eventually see that these are the only two locations on Earth where the fundamental niche of Posidonia occurs. It is also possible that there may be some other locations, but the species has not yet dispersed there. We don't know enough about the requirements to say for sure. But it is clear that those conditions will not occur everywhere. Probably will occur over the very small total area of the oceans in separated patches. So anyway, we can restate this as the niche of any species tends to be restricted to certain places on the planet, not necessarily just one place, but definitely a small or moderate number of places. So in other words, if you look over the entire surface of the Earth, as we're doing here, you see that the niche distribution is patchy. Conditions vary all over the surface of the Earth as a result of temperature variation, topographic variation, soil variation, moisture variation, and so on, without limit. So on a global scale, the niche distribution is patchy. We see a species in patches. This means on a global scale, the distribution is patchy. Simply another way of saying that every species is absent from almost everywhere on the planet. But that's on the global scale. As we start to zero in on a species distribution and narrow down our scale, don't things change? Doesn't the niche distribution start becoming more uniform and predictable? Well, the distribution usually remains patchy as our scale becomes increasingly small, and then is usually no longer patchy by the time we reach the scale of individual organisms. So patchy, patchy. And finally, when we get individual stems, the patchiness disappears. And often we see that individuals might appear spaced at regular intervals as if they're avoiding each other. This is a spaced or uniform distribution. All right, so we start out patchy, and as you zoom in and zoom in more and more, you still see patches, but eventually you get to a uniform distribution of individual organisms or individual ramets. In the case of seabirds, such as this common murre, at a local scale, nesting birds are territorial and defend their nests and young. So the dispersion is uniform at this local scale, even though it's patchy on the global scale. So here you have this patchy distribution on the global scale. Here, here, down here. Then as you zero in, still patchy, the bird nests on islands, patches of island habitat. And then when we get down to the individual scale, the birds are uniformly distributed, keep a distance from each other pretty uniformly. So the distribution is uniform at this local scale, but patchy at a global scale. Many examples of this, for example, clams, such as the Talina tenuis. Here, the experimenters placed clams experimentally in clumps to see what would happen over time. They moved apart, so the distribution became uniform again. And they related that to competition between individual clams in foraging with their siphon on the sand surface. So we have at the global scale, patchy, restricted distribution and niche, then narrow and narrow, distribution stays patchy, continue to zero in. Fine scale, close to the scale of individual organisms, usually no longer patchy, but either uniform or random, usually uniform. And this turns out, a very general rule about species distributions or population dispersion, patchiness at the global scale, also at intermediate scales, but patchiness gives away to some other distribution, often uniform distribution at smaller scale. And why? Usually because a species' niche distribution is very restricted. Why? Because evolutionary trade-offs that trade adaptation to one niche against lack of adaptation to another niche. But a secondary reason is lack of dispersal, and many possible variations on that, um, and many case studies of individual species, still working out the details. So these are the three possible dispersion patterns: clumped, uniform, and random. Because this is a description of events in space, the Poisson distribution applies. So if the occurrence of individuals is entirely independent of the occurrence of other individuals, then you would see that this follows a Poisson distribution. And the variance in number of individuals per unit area, the variance would equal the mean number. That's a Poisson distribution. So if the variance equals the mean, then you have a random distribution. If the variance is much smaller than the mean, then you have a uniform distribution, because there's not much variance because individuals are spaced out. And if the variance is much greater than the mean, then you have a clumped distribution. So we can use the Poisson to actually measure and describe these dispersion patterns. All right, so the next question, we're going to talk about the ideal free distribution and other distributions. And that's the answer to the question, given that resources are patchy, they're in patches across the environment, across space. What is the optimal way for organisms to arrange themselves across those different patches? So how should a population distribute itself across the environment? So let's say in some area we have 3 patches, and these 3 patches have different amounts, different levels of resource, say 60, 30, and 10 units. And let's assume that each individual occupies the patch that maximizes that individual's fitness. How does it maximize its fitness? By moving to the patch that has the highest level of resource per individual, taking into account other individuals that are on the patch already. So if everyone is looking out for number 1 like this, how will the population become distributed over these 3 patches? So let's say there are 100 individuals in the population. How will those 100 individuals distribute themselves? Well, the distribution resulting from each individual behaving to maximize its fitness is 60, 30, and 10 individuals, respectively, in the 60x, 30x, and 10x patches. They should arrange themselves exactly in proportion to the level of resource in each patch. So when each individual is free to move to maximize fitness, the population ultimately will be dispersed exactly in proportion to the resources in these patches. And what does this mean in terms of resources per individual? It means that each individual has the same level of resource. 60-60 is 1, 30-30 is 1, 10-10 is 1. So this distribution of the population is called the ideal free distribution. Everyone's distributed in proportion to the resources in each patch, with the result that the resources are distributed perfectly evenly among everybody. Ideal free distribution, probably the most familiar example in our own lives that we experience of the ideal free distribution on a daily basis, is the number of people in each checkout line at the grocery store. If everybody knew exactly how long every line was going to take, then everybody would distribute themselves in such a way that every line would take the same amount of time to work its way through to you. The faster lines would have more people and the slower lines would have fewer people, so the time required for each line would balance out. So ideal free distributions have been demonstrated experimentally in many species. For example, in stickleback fish and tanks, if you add food to one end of the tank 5 times faster than you add to the other end, the fish distribute themselves in an exact 5-to-1 ratio, 5 in one half, 1 in the other. If you change the food, then the fish reverse themselves. Reverse the food, the fish reverse themselves. Beautiful example of the ideal free distribution. And you can keep doing this as long as you want. And we also see something close to the ideal free distribution in nature when migratory birds fill up habitat after migration. For example, shorebirds migrating and breeding habitat in Alaska. So what generally happens is that the best habitat is filled first. Then as the good habitat is increasingly occupied, birds start filling in a lower quality habitat. And finally, when all the birds have moved in, their distribution is very close to an ideal free distribution. In some cases, however, that distribution is not the ideal free, and in these cases, the departure is usually in a certain direction. Often you have fewer individuals than you would expect in the good patches and more individuals than you would expect in the poor patches. So, why might this be? Well, in order to achieve an ideal free distribution, the organisms need several conditions to be met. First, they need to know how the resources are distributed in these patches in the first place. They have to have knowledge about where the resources are. And second, they need to be free to move among the patches. That's why the word free is in the phrase ideal free distribution. So, why is there a deficiency of individuals in the rich patch of habitat? Maybe because they don't know that the good patch is higher quality than this patch. But that's unlikely and doesn't explain why this pattern happens over and over again. Why would individuals not be aware of only the rich patches? All right, well, you can get an answer by doing this experiment with gulls. Let's say you put out food out in 3 patches like this. Okay, so you have twice as much at this location than at this location. And you have 100 gulls waiting to capitalize on this food that you put out here, waiting to come down and feed on these patches. So, how do you think these gulls would distribute themselves over these 2 areas? One area has twice as much food than the other area. Well, if you do this experiment, you will find that basically one gull will come to this patch, and then another gull will come to this patch, and 98 will be out flying around and watching what happens. Why does this happen? Well, one explanation is social dominance. Often, what you'll find is that the biggest, most aggressive, most dominant individuals will tend to aggressively exclude the less dominant individuals from the prime real estate. And often the animals doing the excluding are the parents, and animals being excluded are the juveniles, the younger generation, not necessarily related to the adults that are aggressively excluding them. So this results in the migration of young birds out of the area of their birth and into unknown territory, most of which is of low quality. This type of distribution is called the despotic distribution. It's the reverse of an ideal free distribution. Individuals are not distributed over an area where each individual gets the same amount of resource, because there are a few individuals which monopolize and aggressively keep the others out. So there's a few individuals with a large amount of resource and a large number of individuals with little or no resource, and a large variation in the ratio of resource to number of individuals among patches. Like there'll be just one or two patches. The best patches will just have one or two, a few individuals in them, and the smaller resource patches will have very large numbers of individuals. What about human beings? Do we follow the ideal free distribution or not? Well, the amount of resources that one American has is equal to the amount that 200 Indians has, or 2,000 Sahelians. So nope, we don't follow the ideal free distribution. All right, and in nature, sometimes the parental generation stays in a good habitat while most of the offspring generation has to leave. So, for example, the yellow-legged gull, and in this species, it nests in areas that have a good habitat, which is a vegetated habitat, and also bad habitat, habitat that's not vegetated. And birds nesting in the good habitat are generally older and more experienced than those nesting in the bad habitat where mortality is higher. And young that are produced in this habitat generally migrate out into the bad habitat. This is a much poorer habitat, and birds that nest here produce fewer young, which have a lower survivorship. In fact, their fitness is so low that they can't maintain a population. So we have two types of patches, and two types of populations. There's a resource-rich source population here, the source population, and a resource-poor, unvegetated sink population. So most birds are produced in the source population, and they are forced out and migrate into the sink population, which would not maintain itself in the absence of the source population. Well, why doesn't the source population go extinct since all these birds are migrating out of it every season? Well, because an excess of birds are produced. More young are produced than is necessary, and if they did not migrate out, the population would keep increasing. So the number of young produced is greater than the number of deaths. And so the population would grow by about 10% per year if there were no emigration of the population. And conversely, the sink populations would decline by about 13% per year if not for the immigration of these excess birds in from the source populations. So here's a graph that shows breeding success, reproductive success in the good habitats here, the open circles, in these years, and also the success in the unvegetated poor habitats in the same years. So this sort of emigration happens fairly frequently in birds and mammals. All right, so let's move to the third topic this week, which is genetic population structure. And we now consider the fact that for most species, environmental conditions are likely to vary across the geographic distribution of the species. So, then the most fit genotype in one place might be different from the most fit genotype in another place, even though the two genotypes can interbreed. All right, so what are the evolutionary consequences then of a variable environment? Well, for example, disruptive selection is a higher fitness of extreme phenotypes than intermediate phenotypes. So, disruptive selection in nature usually occurs because one extreme is favored in one environment and the other extreme is favored in another environment. For example, salmon from one stream might return in September and from an adjacent stream might return in October. The mean return time for the two streams is halfway between September and October. Remember, we're talking about individuals within a single species. If there is disruptive selection for two different types away from the mean, then how will the species evolve? Well, into separate ecotypes or types of individuals within the same species adapted to a special conditions where they live. So, for example, these two populations of Posidonia, one in the Mediterranean, one in Australia, have evolved divergence. There's disruptive selection apparently in the two places, and there's been some differentiation going on. You can identify the species based on their morphology and see that they're different from each other. So if this happens within a single species, within subpopulations that are capable of interbreeding, so within a species, then that's called local adaptation. Okay, but this doesn't necessarily happen. The opposite of local adaptation is global adaptation. And in this case, instead of different ecotypes, each specializing on different environments, just one in between ecotype might evolve, capable of surviving and reproducing in all environments, just not quite as good as each of the specialists. All right, so those are two possibilities. Either you can have local adaptation or global adaptation in a population. And how can you predict which one is going to occur? Well, the answer is it depends on the genetic neighborhood of the population. The genetic neighborhood is a circle whose radius is twice the average individual's dispersal distance over its reproductive lifespan. Or saying the same thing, is the average distance between the birthplaces of two mating individuals. The average distance between the birthplaces of two mating individuals. This difference is the sum of the dispersal of the father with the dispersal of the mother. So it's equal to twice the mean dispersal distance. Okay, so some species have a large genetic neighborhood. Some species have a very small genetic neighborhood in terms of raw distance. So it's fairly straightforward. If the genetic neighborhood subsumes the whole species, then the species will be genetically homogenized every single generation, and there will be little opportunity for local adaptation to occur since genes from one area will be mixed with genes from another area every generation. If the genetic neighborhood is small enough that it does not subsume two adaptively different areas, then most gene exchange each generation will be within these separate adaptive zones. And since less migration occurs between adaptive zones, less genetic homogenization occurs between adaptive zones. And this leaves more opportunity for individuals in different adaptive zones to genetically diverge in response to natural selection. So we've got selection of the yellow over here and of the red over here. So if the neighborhood is too large, it encompasses both of these adaptive zones, then there will be very little divergence across this spatial region. Okay, so here we have 14 genetic neighborhoods from one end of the population to the other. This means that, roughly speaking, 14 reproductive lifetimes or generations are required for the movement of one allele from a gene from one end of the population or landscape to the other end. And during those 14 generations, disruptive selection and adaptive differentiation will be occurring. How much adaptive differentiation will be in existence at any given time? About 14 generations worth. So the expected level of adaptive differentiation is the net amount that produced by disruptive selection every generation minus that eliminated by migration per generation. So if the migration is large per generation because you have a large neighborhood, then there's not going to be much differentiation between the red and the yellow. But if the migration is small each generation, then that allows much greater differentiation into yellows on this side and reds on this side of the region occupied by the population. So population subdivision or isolation, reproductive isolation, tends to inhibit genetic homogenization, which allows evolutionary differentiation as a result of disruptive selection. In the absence of disruptive selection, any evolutionary differentiation will be due to random events. So, for example, random mutation or just random drift of gene frequencies just due to sampling error. So local adaptation appears to be more common in plants than in animals, obviously because plants generally have smaller genetic neighborhoods. And there are many examples in our species of what appears to be local adaptation. For example, skin color varies continuously from light at higher latitudes to dark at the equator. Darker skinned people at the equator have a significantly lower incidence of skin cancer and other UV related skin diseases than lighter skinned people, especially near the equator. Suggests that UV radiation may have selected for darker skin color at the equator than at higher latitudes, and this is disruptive selection, resulting in the observed latitudinal gradient. This difference, however, is not abrupt, but rather very gradual, suggesting that gene flow has occurred freely but slowly between people at the equator and people at higher latitudes. But in order for this gradient to have been generated by natural selection, the genetic neighborhood of the human population must have been much smaller than the geographic scale over which the disruptive selection occurred, based on UV light intensity. And this is reasonable since the distance between the birthplaces of mom and dad probably has been small during evolution of the human lineage. Okay, and in general, species in general, if adaptive divergence is sufficiently pronounced, producing striking physical and genetic differences such that the two types can no longer interbreed, then by definition, the lineage has divided into two separate species. Speciation has occurred. And because speciation is the production of more extreme divergence than just within a species, ecotypes, it requires either stronger disruptive selection or greater isolation. The greater isolation can result from, first, by barriers to migration, and second, by small neighborhood diameters, which slow the rate of gene migration across the population. Barriers to migration is illustrated by the two marine snail species, and these are Nucella ostrina and Nucella emarginata, whose populations have migration barriers caused by shoreline geomorphology, for example, at Point Conception, California. So there's a breakoff point right here at Point Conception. And on opposite sides, the species are different. So these two groups here on the southern end and north of Point Conception have evolved clear differences from each other in morphology. And these differences are great enough that taxonomists have decided they're going to be different species. They used to be just one species. Um, so the Nucella lineage has undergone speciation. And of course, the Posidonia genus is another prime marine example. The Mediterranean species has evolved obvious morphological differences from the Australian species, and there's a large barrier to gene migration between the two locations. Okay, on to the next topic, population growth and regulation. All right, the capability of population growth to tremendous numbers is a central idea in Darwin's struggle for existence. So, as I mentioned in the last couple lectures, the rate of population growth is equivalent to the mean fitness of the organisms in the population. So, if we want to understand how well adapted two types of organisms are in some environment, we can compare their rates of population growth in that environment. So, today we'll start with to develop some mathematical models of population growth. And these are classic models that are fundamental to the field of ecology and are used in some applied form practically every day to understand the behavior of real populations in nature. So right now they're at the center of the coronavirus pandemic, exponential or logistic models for the increase in the number of people infected by the virus. So the most fundamental property of a population is its ability to grow. And they have this ability for one reason. The organisms in the population are capable of reproducing themselves, and they're capable of more than replacing themselves, at least within their niche. Because they can more than replace themselves, their population can increase. Now, at the outset, we will assume in these models, like everybody else does, that our population is dioecious. That is, there's a 50-50 mixture of males and females. And since females are the only sex that produce offspring, we will be interested primarily in the female population, but since the sex ratio is 1-to-1, that basically is the same number of males in the population also. So because the population is only half the real population, the female half, we have to immediately recognize that in order for the population to increase in size, the average female has to produce more than two surviving offspring, not one. And this is because females are only half the population. But again, half these offspring are male, and we are not interested in that half because they usually contribute nothing to population growth, and we encountered this idea already when we considered the cost of meiosis. So we will count only the female offspring of female parents. So the cardinal rule is, in order for a population to increase in size, the average female must produce more than one surviving female offspring. If she does this, then she will on average also produce more than one surviving male offspring, since she produces a 1-to-1 ratio of males and females. And every female organism ever studied is capable of producing more than one female offspring. So this means that every population has the ability to increase in size. All right, and remember the growth rate of the population influences the density, which has a direct effect on fitness, and then fitness also has an influence on the growth rate. So rate of population growth is just expressed visually as a plot of the density n of individuals per some unit of space, and we don't care what that unit is, but we're always implicitly thinking that this is in terms of some unit of space. Okay, so if a population has a faster rate of increase, then the average fitness of an individual in that population is higher than a population that has a lower rate of increase. So we develop mathematical models that show this rate of increase over time. So since females are able to produce more than one surviving female, their population can increase. Otherwise, the population stays the same. Right. So we assume a dioecious population, some number of females and some number of males, assumed to be equal. Only females give birth. So the population density, the total population density is 2n. Each female must produce more than one female offspring. In other words, more than two offspring total. So a historical note, Thomas Malthus, remember, 1798 essay on the principle of population caused a profound change in thinking about population, resources, human poverty, and the quality of life. So Malthus used this essay to reply to the rational utopianists of the time who asserted that mankind could eliminate poverty and crime and the need for laws purely through an act of rational will. All right. And so he disagreed. And he countered this argument with the pessimistic idea that a universal biological law exists. As long as resources permit populations to increase, they will always increase at the maximum rate, which is the geometric or exponential rate. And they'll only stop increasing when it's physically no longer possible for them to increase. In other words, when death or starvation or disease and war prevent them from increasing. So the vast majority of populations, including human populations, according to Malthus, are in a state of misery or soon will be. This condition is essentially permanent or it can be only temporarily relieved by increasing the availability of resources. But even then, the population will only increase rapidly to a new plateau where the misery continues. So it was a depressing idea, that the global human population is proceeding along the same route, geometric increase, inevitably to a state of profound suffering, catastrophic famine, war, social upheaval. And when the plateau is reached, soon he believed it would be reached, the suffering will be a permanent fact of life for the human population. So according to Malthus, poverty, crime, war, disease are biologically inevitable, essentially permanent, or relieved only transiently and caused by the principle of the population. So there is no utopia possible because of this universal biological principle. This idea has profound economic implications with Malthus, which Malthus developed over his life, and basically six subsequent versions of this essay, each bigger than the previous. And so Darwin seized on this idea in chapter 3 of his Origin of Species, which he called Struggle for Existence, as we know. And he reasoned that if most populations exist on the edge of what resources allow, and individuals are only barely able to replace themselves, then individuals with a small advantage in ability to exploit or control or use resources will then have a tremendous selective advantage. In other words, if resources tend to be scarce in general, then selection will tend to be strongest. Differences in fitness among individuals will be greatly magnified. Or you can consider the argument in the reverse. If resources are infinite, then there will be little or no difference in fitness between individuals. No matter what you do or how you are built, there's never a shortage of resource. So selection is weak or non-existent. So Darwin believed that most selection occurred in the context of extreme resource depletion in populations, increased to their maximum possible size for their environment. To make this argument, however, he needed to counter the possibility that populations might not exist at the maximum density because their rate of increase is extremely slow. And he imagined that people would find this to be the fatal flaw in his entire theory. So he wanted to argue against this. And to do so, he made some simple calculations using, as an example, what he thought was the slowest reproducing well-known species of animal, namely the African elephant. So he calculated how long it would take one pair of elephants to reach an outrageously high population density. So he concluded that even for elephants starting with just one pair, only a few centuries are necessary before the population explodes to over 20 million. And the critical assumption here with these calculations is that resources are not limiting. what we want to show is that is that if resources are not limiting, then populations will increase exponentially, as Malthus described. So we start by assuming that resources are infinite. And if this is true, then population growth depends only on the number of individuals in the population and the contribution of each individual to the growth rate of the population. This contribution is called the per capita rate of increase, which we'll talk about below. Okay, let's assume for our first example that we have a female elephant, as Darwin assumed. Let's assume also that our elephant at age 50 years produces 2 surviving female offspring. And let's say that all her daughters, granddaughters, and all the rest of her female descendants do the same. They produce 2 surviving female offspring. And let's say also that right at the same instant, a female produces her offspring, then she dies. This is not because we don't like elephants, it's just for simplicity. Simplicity of the model to start out with. So how fast will the population grow? So to picture population growth, we make a plot of population size versus time. N is the population size, but it can also be population density since we're restricting ourselves to some defined area, okay? So N per unit of constant area is also density. So the graph of N against time is called the population trajectory. So let's say we start with 1 female elephant, then in 50 years, she produces 2 female offspring and dies. So in 50 years, all of a sudden, we have 2 female elephants. And from now on, we'll just assume we're talking about females and we don't have to qualify it anymore with the word female elephant every time. So in 100 years, there will be 4, then 8 in 150, then 16 in 200, and so on. So every 50 years, the elephant population doubles. 50 years is the doubling time of the elephant population. Doubling time is central to describing population growth. For example, the coronavirus rate of exponential population growth. And in many locations, the doubling time for the number of confirmed cases is only 2 to 3 days. Okay, just as an aside. Because in this elephant population, everybody reproduces at the same time and it happens once every generation. We don't have a smooth curve representing population size. Instead, we have this jagged series of abrupt steps. Because we don't have a continuous smooth curve, this population growth is not continuous. It's called discrete. Discrete population growth, in which resources are not limiting, assuming that resources are not limiting, is also called geometric. So geometric is a synonym for discrete. All right, we've been leading up to the rate of growth of the population. What is the rate of growth of the population? Since our population increases only every generation, which happens to be 50 years, and holds steady in between, the natural way to express the growth is per generation. So what does it do each generation? It doubles. But the growth rate is change in n per generation. This is equal to n at time t plus 1 minus n at the time t, and that's equals 2 times n at the time t minus n at time t equals n at time t equals 2 times n at t minus 1. So this is the basic equation. At any particular time, the density at that time is twice the density at the previous time, and we're talking about generations. T is the number of generations. So on a per generation basis, we have our population growth rate. At any time t, the growth rate of the population is twice what it was in the previous generation. So we can express this population growth very simply mathematically. Population at a given time is equal to twice the population at the previous time. So here is time in units of generations. So how do we calculate the population size after many generations? Well, we start with n at time 0, multiply it by 2 to get n at time 1, and we multiply by 4 to get n2, by 8 to get n3, by 16 to get n4, and so on. So the general rule is n after t generations is n at time 0 generations multiplied by 2 taken to the t power. So after 10 generations, we have 2 to the 10 individuals, or 1,024 elephants. And after 15 generations, we have 2 to the 15 individuals, or 32,600 or 768 elephants. After 20 generations, we have 2 to the 20 individuals, or 1.05 million elephants. After 50 generations, we have 1.1 quadrillion elephants, or 1 with 15 zeros after it. So we have the very simple result that if an elephant produces 2 surviving offspring, she will have created, after 50 generations, a very large population of elephants, size being about 1 quadrillion, which, if you piled all those elephants on the surface of the earth, it would create an elephant layer on the surface of the earth. I don't know how high, maybe halfway to the moon. So in general, the rate of increase can be any number, not necessarily 2, as we've assumed in this example. And in the case of a geometrically increasing population, the rate of increase is symbolized by the Greek letter lambda, which is sort of an upside down y, and lambda is called the geometric rate of increase, or the finite rate of increase. And that's just equal to n at times t divided by n at times t minus 1. So to calculate the population after t generations, we just multiply the starting population by lambda taken to the tth power. Right, if lambda is greater than 1, then the population is increasing. If lambda is equal to 1, the population size is constant. And if lambda is less than 1, the population is decreasing. So this is geometric growth. Population increases as this sort of step function shape. That's geometric growth. It's not continuous. Now, this is obviously an unrealistic example of population growth. It's unrealistic in many ways. One way we can make the example a little more realistic is to turn it from a discrete model to a continuous model. So instead of a jagged stairway, a nice smooth curve. Why would we have a smooth curve? Well, if we started out with females of all different ages so that reproduction occurs every year or continuously, we don't have a big slug of individuals who all reproduce at the same time and die. So all this death and reproduction that occurs at once instead doesn't occur at once, it occurs at random throughout this interval. And if it's spread continuously throughout this interval, then it gives you a nice smooth population trajectory rather than an abrupt jagged trajectory. So if that's the case, we'll have a nice continuous line that passes through all these points. And because this line passes through all these same points, it follows the exact same equation as before. N at times t is equal to lambda the tth power times n at times 0. Only now our t can take on any intermediate value. It doesn't have to be at exactly the same time as the generation time passes. We can plug t into this equation and get the value on this curve for any value of t. So continuous population growth is no longer discrete, so it's no longer called geometric. It's now called exponential population growth if resources are infinite, and the only thing determining the growth rate is the number of individuals. All right, the rate of increase, the amount by which the population increases in one generation, if it's discrete, is just the difference between this n and this n. That's the amount it increases in one generation. the difference between the n at one generation minus the n at the previous generation. But this n here is lambda times the n at the previous generation. So when you subtract n at the previous generation, you just get lambda minus 1 times n at the previous generation. That's the rate of increase per generation in a discrete population. Okay, but now if we assume that it's continuous, by convention, we do this subtle shift. If we want to know what the rate of increase of this population is at time t, the convention that everybody uses now changes. We no longer call the rate of increase lambda minus 1 times n at times t. Why? Because lambda is the ratio of n at reproductive time t to n at reproductive time t minus 1. But now there is no discrete reproductive time since reproduction is continuous. So these two values no longer have any special significance. They're just 2 points on a continuous curve. So these 2 points are just 2 points on a continuous curve. So what we really want is the slope of the curve. Now that it's continuous, we can calculate the slope, which is the slope of this line that's tangent to the curve at some point. So here's where the calculus comes in. It just so happens that the slope of this curve is proportional to n. In other words, the slope is equal to some constant times n. Let's call that constant little r. This constant must be, by definition, the per capita rate of increase, which I mentioned above. Well, this makes sense. As you increase n, the slope of the graph increases also. So we can use this little r as our indicator of the rate of increase of the population. The bigger it is, the bigger the slope of this curve at any point, which means the faster the rate of increase. So what is r then? Here's where calculus comes in again. It turns out that r is just the natural logarithm of lambda. What's a natural logarithm? It's just the log base e. E is a special number in calculus equal to about 2.72. The natural log of a number is just how many times you have to multiply e by itself to get to the number. So by definition, the log base e of e to the r is equal to r. So if you multiply e by itself r times, you get the number you get is lambda. So if you take e to the r power, you get lambda. E to the r power is equal to lambda right here. In other words, the natural log of lambda is equal to r. So the slope of this curve is Rn, and the rate of increase of the population is R times n. So I'll use the term rate of increase of the population rather than write down the calculus notation, dn dt, which is the same as the rate of increase of the population, the instantaneous rate. This is because we won't be actually doing any calculus, so it doesn't make much sense to use the notation. But if Rn is the slope of the curve, then it's the rate of increase of the population. But this means that R then is the rate of increase divided by n. That's little r here is the rate of increase divided by n. Or R is the rate of increase of the population per individual. So R represents then the amount that each of the n individuals contributes to the growth rate of the population. If each of the n individuals contributes little r to the growth rate of the population, then the total growth rate has to be r times n. or R again is the per capita rate of increase of the population. The rate of increase of the population reflects how fast individuals can reproduce themselves on average. But not only are individuals reproducing themselves, they are also dying. So the rate of increase of the population is a balance between the creation of new individuals and the loss of old individuals. And this rate of increase is then the difference between the total number of births and the total number of deaths in some small interval of time. So the slope of this curve is equal to the total birth rate minus the death rate at any given instant, or B minus D. B is the total number of births, and D is the total number of deaths in the population in a small time interval. But this is equal to little r times n, which means that little r is equal to the birth rate minus the death rate, all divided by n. Birth rate minus the death rate, all divided by n. So we could call it the per capita birth rate minus the per capita death rate. The per capita birth rate divided by n, minus the per capita death rate, the death rate divided by n. Okay, so we can write down little b and little d for the per capita birth rate and the per capita death rate. So if during some small time interval 10 individuals are born, and from a population of 100, and 10 individuals die from the same starting population of 100, then little r is equal to b minus d, or divided by n, which is 0.1 minus 0.1, so the little r would be 0, and the population does not increase. So what is little r for our elephants? Well, lambda is 2, and r is the log base e of lambda. So r is 0.69 in our example. Since e to the r is lambda, we can substitute to create our continuous version of the geometric version. These two equations are actually mathematically identical. But the lambda version is usually used for discrete models, and the version with e is used for continuous models. And both of these assume that resources are infinite. So we can also use this continuous equation, the E form, to calculate n after some fractional number of generations. Let's say, just for the fun of it, 50.2 generations. So then n is equal to e to the 0.69 times 50.2 times n times 0, which is 1, female elephant. And that's equal to, and this is wrong, what's in this slide, it should be 1.1 quadrillion. That's times 10 to the 15 elephants. All right, now a fundamental property that falls out of these equations is the doubling time of the populations, or the amount of time it takes a population to double in time. So we can calculate that easily. We assumed in our example that the elephant population doubled every generation. Let's say we didn't know that. How would we calculate it? Well, we know that n at time t is equal to e to the rt times n at time 0, this top equation. What does t have to be to make n at times t over n at time 0 equal 2? Well, that would be the doubling time. So we just set this equal to 2, so this ratio is equal to 2. So n at t is double n at 0. And we solve for t, so t comes out to be the natural log of 2, the log base e of 2 divided by little r. That's the doubling time. So we know that little r is 0.69, and we can calculate the log of 2 is equal to 0.69. So t equals 1 generation, meaning that the population doubles every 1 generation, just like we assume. So our equation works. Right, the doubling time always stays constant if resources are infinite. This is because little r, is always constant if resources are infinite. So if, for this example, this particular population will double from generation 1 to 2, and it will also double from generation 24 to 25 and 49 to 50. Or we can turn this around. Let's say we know the doubling time of a species is 5 generations. What's little r? Well, little r is the natural log of 2 divided by t, and t is 5. So this ends up being 0.138, 1.4 would be little r. So we can express t in any units we want. They don't have to be in terms of generations. It can be in years rather than generations. Then r in our elephant example is no longer 0.69, it's 0.69 divided by the number of years per generation. So that's 0.69 divided by 50 equals 0.0138. So on a per year basis, r for our elephant example is 0.014, roughly. That's the per capita rate of increase per year rather than per generation. So we have an elephant population that increases from 1 to 1 quadrillion in 50 generations, which is 2,500 years. That's a pretty big increase. It's big enough to impress two of the most influential thinkers about population growth in the 18th and 19th centuries. These were Thomas Malthus and Charles Darwin. But Darwin could have carried this argument one step further. He could have asked, who is the fittest within a given population? How do we know who is the fittest? Who the fittest will be in the struggle for existence? And the answer is those individuals in the population or species with the fastest rate of increase. They will increase in numbers faster, and thus their descendants will be more abundant than those of other individuals. And if this difference continues, then their descendants will eventually become the entire population. So rate of increase among individuals within a population is the same as fitness. So one classic example of exponential or geometric growth is the famous gray seal population on Sable Island in Nova Scotia. This is an island known for its population of wild horses. The seals were hunted to near extinction on this island by 1960, when hunting was prohibited. Since then, their population has increased exponentially. And now Sable Island is the largest breeding colony of gray seals in the world. Exponential growth also occurs commonly in single-celled organisms, such as in phytoplankton blooms. If nutrients are scarce, population sizes are small, but when upwelling occurs, nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, increase suddenly, and they trigger an explosive growth in the phytoplankton population. And an exponential growth turns out to be a straight line on the log scale. And this is the log scale on the y-axis. So we have this bloom that is exponential right here over a period of a couple of weeks. And then the population crashes when the nutrients also crash. Okay, that's it for today. Next week, we'll continue talking about population growth and regulation of population size. Have a great rest of your day.